Cecilia, welcome back to the Business Immigration Benchmark. We're so happy to have our immigration policy expert from the Niskanen Center here today with us to walk us through post-election results. We're going to see a Trump administration. And my first question, Cecilia, is what can we expect as far as changes in policy and shifts in operational challenges under what will be the new Trump administration?
Yeah, thanks so much, Laura, for having me back. I'm happy to be here to talk to you again. So I think that really what I'm looking at when thinking about former President Trump going into office once again, what we can look at is what he did during his first administration and also things he's discussed and plans he's discussed in terms of his second term. So that kind of gives us insight into what we might expect, what we might expect to see. And so even though a second Trump administration could operate a little differently, than in the past, there are some things that are likely. For instance, it's really likely we're going to see longer processing times. We're probably going to see greater rates of RFEs, additional scrutiny. There might be limited use of deference to prior USCIS decisions, greater oversight on immigrant workers who are working remotely or at third-party work sites, potentially a greater focus on salaries as indicators of domestic need, perhaps by prioritizing H-1B petitions based on salaries of some sort, or potentially cutting lower prevailing wage levels. I think businesses might also be affected by policies related to L2 and H4 work authorization or their access to work authorization, or by some potential changes to the student visa's optional practical training program. All of those could kind of influence how businesses are experiencing the US immigration system, and all of it's kind of to be seen as to what changes are actually implemented in a few months.
Yeah, no kidding. And you mentioned a little bit there about the adjustments to wage leveling or wage requirements. How do you think the adjustments to the wage requirements will impact the ability of companies to hire and sponsor foreign national workers?
I would say that hiring foreign talent through the employment-based immigration system is already costly between legal fees, visa fees, application fees, the list goes on. But not having the talent needed is also costly and can affect business continuity and productivity. So it is possible that in a second Trump administration, there is the greater emphasis on wage requirements or a tightening of wage requirements. Like I said, they could choose that the lottery, rather than being based on a random selection, it could be based on those with the higher salary levels, or they could change the prevailing wage requirements in general. And it will then depend on the company and their individual circumstances if they're able to meet those requirements. But for some companies, a lack of qualified domestic alternatives will kind of leave them with no option but to do so. And so, what we may see is a narrowing of opportunities, particularly for foreign students who are coming off of OPT, because depending on the types of changes that are made, it could be harder for an international student with just 1 to 3 years of US work experience to get the same H-1B visa that they might qualify for now. And this could have larger consequences as those students seek opportunities in other competitor nations. And then we could lose a pipeline of US trained professionals that might have otherwise filled critical gaps in the US labor market. So those are all kinds of things to keep in mind. It's unclear what the specific changes will be right now, but regardless of how it operates, it'll depend on the company whether or not they are able to meet those. And then depending on the populations as well that are able to feed into those programs based on those new requirements.
Yeah, so it sounds like the narrowing of the wage requirements, or rather the increasing of the wage requirements, like some expect perhaps those entry-level wages, one, and entry-level wage two could be removed entirely in a future Trump administration. And that would eliminate almost effectively the ability for entry-level foreign national workers to be sponsored under the H-1B.
Right, which could be quite problematic for international students
Sure.
and individuals who are really producing some of the only talent in certain, areas and industries that we have, and they might end up choosing to go elsewhere and take those talents to a place that is willing to foster the inclusion of these entry-level candidates as well.
Yeah, it kind of has a whole ecosystem impact because if foreign nationals who would otherwise opt into top flight STEM programs in the US to then find work opportunities post graduation, you're going to start seeing fewer foreign national students enter those programs to then, not have graduating options. So it kind of is a whole systemic issue.
Right.
What can businesses anticipate if the new administration eliminates or scales back domestic visa renewal? We saw that pilot program roll out with much anticipation and success this year, as well as visa interview waivers outside the US. How do you see that playing out for businesses? Do you anticipate these programs to be scaled back? Can you talk a little bit about some of these programs we've come to love in the last couple of years?
I definitely think that it's possible that we will see these programs at least revised or rolled back. And I think that, it's pretty straightforward, but I think that the danger in that is it could spell trouble for consular wait times. We saw consular wait times hit extreme highs during and following the pandemic that created complications for our businesses, both that had trouble getting their employees here, but also on those that, rely on tourist expenditure to maintain their business. And so these wait times were brought down in part with the help of the initiatives like the domestic visa renewal or the interview waivers. And so if these initiatives are eliminated, it's possible that interconsular wait times could creep back up, especially if their elimination is not matched with other alternatives to maximize staff efficiency or just post efficiency. And we have had huge demand for American visas recently. But if these provisions are removed, they will really need to be paired with other strategies for managing that demand. Otherwise, companies could be facing longer delays, not just at USCIS on the scrutiny side, but also at state, as they're facing not only additional scrutiny and consulates abroad, but also just overwhelmed staff that don't have time to meet everything based on the appointments that were previously being issued through visa or interview waivers or domestic renewal and now have to be processed through consulates abroad.
Yeah, this would be a huge impact to business as usual because foreign national employees will just have a lack of ability to travel internationally because of these expected delays. Like the recommendation would then be for these foreign nationals who need to secure new visa stamps to not go abroad because the timeline would be too big of a risk to then have any sort of expectation of return from abroad, given how lengthy consular delays could potentially be. Do you think this is a priority? In the list of things we started out with, like where we're seeing shifts, do you think scaling back the domestic renewal program or visa interviews, stuff that impacts Department of State, do you think that will be on a priority list for the Trump administration?
It's hard to tell what is the priority and what's going to be kind of in those first 100 days. But I think that it's something that hasn't really been touched as much on the campaign trail. And so I think that that could be to our benefit in a sense that if it hasn't really been priority, they might be focusing their efforts primarily on internal enforcement, which has been a marker of their campaign and a marker of all of their work on the campaign trail and things they've been championing since day one at all of their rallies. And so I think that it's possible that this kind of flies under the radar for a little bit, but I think that eventually, there will be this scrutiny over a lot of levels of the immigration system, both legal and illegal. And I think that when it's looking through that and at all levels, that includes the interviews that are happening at state and the people that are getting through without an interview. And so I think that particularly the interview waiver issue could come to a head and could be something that we see cuts to in the future. But it's yet to be seen because we haven't had any specific commentary on this from the Trump campaign yet. But I do think that it's something that could eventually come to the forefront.
Thank you for that. What broader effects do you think could more stringent vetting criteria have on the pool of foreign talent entering the US and the diversity of skills available in the US labor market?
So first say that vetting the talent that we attract is not a bad thing. It's an important part of our national security strategy. We should know who's coming, what they're coming here to do. However, at a certain point, it can become difficult to attract and retain that foreign talent if scrutiny becomes an impediment to bringing talent here. And especially when we consider the kind of world we're operating in, when our competitors are constantly innovating and coming up with new visa pathways for the talent they need, often directly targeting US trained talent that is frustrated by our system's inefficiencies and unpredictability. So I think that when scrutiny gets to a point where perhaps petitions that were previously approved are now subject to new scrutiny, it is possible that previously undetected errors or inconsistencies are identified, but it's also possible that processing times for trusted immigrant workers at trusted US companies are delayed and that US businesses are forced to operate without this talent for a period of time, are facing longer delays, even though they are these trusted individuals. And they might end up choosing to look for solutions in Canada or in other nearby nations. And so I think that this is something to really be careful to strike a balance between, of making sure that we prioritize our national security, but at the same time, we're working within the means that we have, is that there are trusted businesses and workers who have been using our immigration system for decades and have been done so following every letter of the law. And those individuals and those companies should not be punished in pursuit of our national security.
Yeah, because the headlines that we read and have been reading and will be reading in the coming days are, the tightening of and clamping down on illegal immigration. What my clients in the employment-based space are nervous about is the tightening and clamping down on pathways to legal immigration. And what we saw under the first Trump administration was the difficulty to extend, an H-1B worker who's been here for 10, 12 years waiting in line for the green card that's backlogged, and to extend their status became much more difficult, scrutinized, sometimes denied under quite arbitrary grounds. And it's one of those things where it's not a security concern. It's more of just a reinterpretation to absurd lengths under, this large discretion that immigration service does have. So I think that's the sort of main worry we're sort of seeing, is like that these visa classifications will continue to exist, but in the name of restricting immigration, they're going to do it in some arbitrary ways that could be very damaging to business as usual for folks that have been trusted. The piece that I think does make sense is the scrutiny on the front end. So the F1, visa holder that's coming over here to join the US immigration sort of system or university system. Do you think we're going to see fewer foreign national students in the coming years? Like, do you think that because that's often the sort of first time someone has to go through Department of State immigration review, security concerns, do you think we're going to see an uptick in denials for like first visa applicants? Do you think we're going to see discouragement of new applicants?
I think that that is possible, that students are very responsive. I think that we've seen that students respond to immigration opportunities. When STEM LPT was introduced, STEM enrollment by foreign students increased because there was this new opportunity for an immigration pathway in the United States to find gainful employment and to contribute, meaningfully to the US economy. So I think that students are really reactive and can respond to changes in immigration policy. And I think that it's possible, as much as it swung that way in terms of the introduction of new opportunities, it could also be responsive to a tightening around that. There were previous changes to enrollment when students felt that the rhetoric around immigration had changed. And so that I think that it's possible we see under another Trump administration, we could see dwindling levels of foreign student enrollment if they feel that the environment is not conducive to their continuation of their case and their work in economy in the US labor market after graduation. If they're not able to find a job or they feel that the visa options are very limited, it could dissuade them from coming to study in the United States because of the limited opportunities, or they could be dissuaded by rhetoric that they perceive it to be in the public eye based on things that are coming out of the next administration. And so I think that students really are a very dynamic group that can respond to changes, and they're not oblivious to what is happening in policy. And so I think that they are oftentimes, especially the top talent that is coming, they are really responsive and looking for long-term opportunities. And so going to other places that are really hoping to foster international talent and are creating longer term sustainable pathways for them, that might become an attractive alternative if they feel that those opportunities are not here. How quickly that could happen, I'm not sure. And it'll definitely depend what it is that is coming down the pipeline from the Trump administration, how quickly those changes are implemented, and then how quickly the student bodies could respond. But I definitely think that if the environment becomes very difficult for students to stay afterwards, if that is the direction that we're heading, then of course students could respond by having lower enrollment rates, especially those top students who have offers and opportunities to go study in other competitor nations.
Yeah, no kidding. The other thing I'm thinking about that happened under the previous Trump administration is a new nationality travel ban or travel restrictions. Is that something you're expecting within the first 100 days? What are your thoughts on that occurring in the new Trump administration?
I think he has said publicly that this is something that he is looking into doing or thinking about doing. And I think it really depends on what type of restrictions are introduced. In the past, most of the nationality based restrictions primarily targeted permanent immigration and exempted temporary non immigrants from those restrictions. And so, if similar measures are introduced, it's not that the business community would not be affected. There might still be new restrictions on the types of immigration programs that are available to businesses, but there may still be able to access talent that they need through temporary pathways. However, this is, something that all your clients and their global mobility professionals should absolutely keep in mind when they're considering travel schedules and visa renewal schedules as well, because these things could change very quickly when new policies are introduced or challenges in litigation change the circumstances of existing restrictions, as many of the previous measures were litigated. And so I think that it's just something to constantly keep in mind, and it's going to depend on what the specific parameters of a new program are. I do think that it's something that they're thinking about because they have spoken about it publicly, but what are the specific provisions of that and who would be affected and how broadly it would be impactful in that community is yet to be seen.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think for our companies that have folks that might be caught up in a new nationality travel restriction, travel ban, you'll want to do any kind of extensions within the US. It's interesting post COVID and seeing under the Biden administration reduction in consular wait times. We have been sending more folks abroad for visa renewals because, frankly, it's faster and cheaper because you don't have to pay the USCIS new asylum fee. So there's been a sort of a shift under the Biden administration to send more folks abroad for L1 visa renewals. And now I think we're going to be making a recommendation to shift back for USCIS rules, even if there's increased vetting, increased extension challenges within the US Immigration Service. That foreign national has more rights or more ability to appeal those decisions when they're in the US, because when they're outside the US and up against Department of State from a just what kind of support can the company, a legal representative do, it's quite limited. So that'll be something, again, to sort of advise narrowly when we see more information on how broad a nationality-based travel restriction, travel ban would look like. What else should we be mindful of in, the closing of the Biden administration and transition into the new Trump administration?
Sure. So I do think that one thing to keep in mind, and I probably mentioned this on the last time that I was on with you all, but we do have this open H-1B rule. And, deference, I think, is something that's definitely top of mind for, looking especially into a Trump administration and what was previously exercised at USCIS under the first Trump administration. And so I think that this pending H-1B rule, at this point, a little bit skeptical that it will be finalized during the lame duck period. It's unclear at this point, but it's possible that it could be finalized. Parts of it could be finalized, and it's possible that it could be withdrawn. And so I think that those changes, it's possible that it is all withdrawn and then the rule is no longer exists. And then we go into a Trump administration with the same status quo that we have now. But it is possible that parts of those are finalized, and then we will be waiting to see how a Trump administration responds when it takes office based to any changes that might be happening right now. So I think that that's one thing to really keep an eye out for, to see what the Biden administration decides to do with it in its last few months. And I think that it could have some changes that may or may not last so long in the Trump administration. But if it's withdrawn, I think at least we will know that everything will remain the same. But that means that deference will not be in the regulation. So I think that there's a lot to be seen with that and what the Biden administration decides to do.
Okay, last question. I want it to be straightforward, but I realize anything in this space is not. Just given from a timing standpoint, Trump comes into office in January. Could he possibly change anything that would impact the H-1B lottery season this year or for 2025?
My sentiment is that it's possible. I think that if
Okay.
it's something that is a priority for him as soon as he joins, takes the administration, I think it's possible that he could make changes, even if it's just on the scrutiny side, or changing the lottery itself. I do think that it's possible that he could make those changes if he acts quickly to do so once he takes office. However, that has not been a, you know, key point of his campaign, like the mass deportations have, and this kind of internal enforcement mechanism. So I think that it's likely that those, in terms of immigration, that those might be more of his focus right at the start, which means that perhaps this year's H-1B lottery continues as usual with some additional delays at USCIS without major changes, though. So I think that that's possible, but because right now that's not necessarily seen as a number one priority that he's really been championing on the campaign trail, but it depends also who he's employing and who's he's getting in charge of USCIS and in charge of DHS. If he's bringing in other people who maybe aren't so focused on the mass deportations in the way that he has publicly focused on it, if he's bringing in people who are more focused on programs like the H-1B, it's possible that I do think we could see some changes ahead of the lottery.
Okay, so we're going to have to stay on our toes on this. But to your point, yeah, there's been signals about what the priorities are, but that doesn't mean that this H-1B season will be left untouched and that it is theoretically possible that he has enough time to make some changes, which all just means stay tuned here. Cecilia, we'll have you back on when there's more and more information with what you're gathering on the Trump administration and what to expect in the immigration space.
Absolutely. I'll be happy to be back. And, thank you. And it's just something to constantly keep in mind of what's changing. And it's going to change day by day as we learn more, approaching inauguration.
Well, we know you've had an extremely busy week. Thank you for spending some of your time here. We value your insights on all immigration policy. Thanks for coming on the Business Immigration Benchmark today, Cecilia.
Thanks, Laura.